This is the last meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club for fall semester 2024. Last academic year, the Socratic Club celebrated its 20th year of operation, which I can't believe that myself. But anyway, we've been sponsoring talks and panels for 20 years here on the Gonzaga campus. And you may have wondered, if you don't know about Socratic Club, you may be confused by the name because it is not really a club and it doesn't really focus on Socrates. So you might wonder, why the name then? Well, the club is named in honor of the Oxford Socratic Club, which was one of the many intellectual academic organizations that existed on the Oxford University campus in the mid-1900s. The Oxford Socratic Club was presided over by a very well-known Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis. Even though he didn't start the club, he was invited to be the first president of the club. Students were looking for an organization that would bring people of wildly different views together. Hence, the reference to Socrates and a comment that Socrates makes in the Republic about following the argument wherever it leads. And so the idea is we're a broadly philosophical organization asking questions, especially about Christian worldview issues. That's what the name's really all about. If you're interested in the Socratic Club and don't know about it or want to be kept abreast of events, it's pretty easy to find. Just do a Google search, Gonzaga Socratic Club, and it'll pull it up. And you can sign up for a mailing list. I promise I do not constantly bombard with messages. I won't fill your inbox with spam. But we have about 4 events each semester during the academic year, once a month, basically. We already have some of the events for spring set up, including a talk by a Gonzaga philosophy professor on philosophy of religion, and a visit to Gonzaga University by former Gonzaga president Robert Spitzer in an event co-sponsored with the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. Father Spitzer is going to be delivering a set of talks on faith, science, and the Bible, so that should be pretty interesting. Stay tuned for more information. Our talk tonight is one that I'm very excited about. Gonzaga is, as I would assume most of you know, a Jesuit Catholic humanist institution. And all 3 of those threads are not really separate threads, but Jesuit identity brings together a particularly humanist approach to Catholic Christianity. People are often unsure about what the Jesuits are all about and what Jesuit mission really means. I think for our purposes, it's helpful to highlight 3 strands, 3 important dimensions of Jesuit ministry that we can see has effects on the founding of the university and its nature. First, the Society of Jesus is an intellectual religious order. Secondly, the Society of Jesus is a missionary or evangelistic religious order. And thirdly, the Society of Jesus is a culturally engaged religious order. And all 3 of those dimensions are really important in the history of Jesuit missionary and evangelistic work in China, starting very close to the founding of the Jesuits, not long after the Reformation. Our speaker today is a historian of Chinese history from Whitworth University, with all kinds of honors and achievements to his name, including a series of publications on topics mainly focused on cultural engagement and comparative religion, East-West Christianity and Chinese religions. Anthony Clark is professor of Chinese history and holder of an endowed chair at Whitworth University where he has a chair he's held since 2015. He's particularly interested in the intellectual, scientific, and religious missionary activities during the eras from the 16 to 18, well, 16 to 1900s. And he's a student and scholar of Chinese and Chinese history, and we are fortunate to have him here. So would you please help me welcome Anthony Clark.
Thank you. I hope, can you all hear me all right? So my remarks should last about 35 to 40 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time afterward for discussion. And I just want to begin by saying it's just so good to be here with you all, and I'm grateful to Professor Calhoun for inviting me. It's good to see old friends, honored fellow Asianists, Professor Cunningham. It's just an honor to be here. And I know of and mind you, I'm prone to protracted peripatetic tangents. So my sense about the way I approach things is to try my best to read. And I'll try to be as exhilaratingly animated as I read my remarks as possible. But I know a popular quote by Socrates that asserts this, quote, strong minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, weak minds discuss people. I'll be discussing all three, so I'm going to let you judge regarding whether my remarks are strong, average, or weak. As a historian, I think I talk more about people and events than anything else. I'm especially honored to participate in this gathering because it is always a delight to be with fellow thinkers who enjoy thinking about how important thinkers inform our past and present. And there's this Chinese saying that really moves me when I'm around other professors, 海内存知己，天涯必若邻. When people from a distance gather and are like-minded, they become like neighbors. Now, my talk today posits some musings on a book that I now have in production, my second book on the Jesuit enterprise in China, monograph. I've written about Jesuits quite a lot in the past. It's a book that considers how the evolutionary curve of Jesuit dramatic representations of China constructed the Western imagination of Asia. I'm interested in the role that Jesuits played in how China is imagined in the West, because this imagination has changed drastically since the 17th and 18th centuries. So my remarks may be peripatetic, to use that word again, but I'll hopefully have something of a cohesive argument embedded in my ramblings. During the Enlightenment, many Western Europeans, such as Leibniz and Voltaire, elevated China as the apotheosis of civilized society. But by the 19th century, China had become denigrated to the point of being invaded by Britain during the First Opium War. During both the era of the Western adulation of China as culturally superior to the Christian West, and the era of Western depreciation of China as both backward and anemic, Jesuit missionaries labored to represent China in a positive hue, largely through an extensive volume of epistolary exchange and dramatic plays, an old Jesuit tradition of theater, now preserved in archives across the globe. Post-1842, Jesuit theatrical and literary representation engendered the Western impression of China less as either a cultural alternative to the West, or even as the cultural inferior to the West, as much as a culture that shines brighter than others once it is, as they say, quote, fulfilled by the spiritual message brought to the Middle Kingdom by the Society of Jesus. And just as a side note, the Jesuits returned to China in 1842 after the suppression of the society from 1773 to 1814. And interestingly, during the suppression, many Jesuits were late in discovering that the suppression had happened, and then after the suppression, it took them a while to get back to China. One of the related points I hope to make here is that Jesuit correspondence between China and the West was not only part of the society's ambition to promote China and its religious mission, but their letters also revealed very human feelings precipitated by the social transformations eddying around them during the late Qing dynasty. In addition to highlighting the humanity of the post-1842 Jesuits in China, I'll suggest that Jesuit drama or theater served to resurrect China from the pejorative views disseminated in the West during the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'll begin by contextualizing the Jesuit culture and enterprise during China's late imperial era, focusing mostly on the lives of 4 French Jesuits who later appeared in stirring plays performed in China's eastern provinces. My next step is learning how to advance my slides. Here we go.
Oh dear.
That's all right.
Ain't technology grand.
It can be. So maybe this.
Maybe click on the image and then,
Oh,
there we go.
wow, that was beautiful. All right. In the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, the exercitant is encouraged to fight against desolation of heart. She or he is reminded to be patient and look forward to the consolation to come. Quote, "Let him who is in desolation strive to persevere in patience," Ignatius writes, "and let him think that he will be speedily consoled." Jesuit missionaries went to China only after making the spiritual exercises, as all Jesuits in formation had done. And words such as these were in the minds of those confreres as they endured seasickness and storms on their long voyage to the celestial empire. Scholars tend to focus on the scientific, Christian, and Jesuit aspects of the histories of these missionaries to China. But while they did spend long hours, quote, exercising the spirit, we should remember that these missionaries were also the children of concerned parents, siblings to brothers and sisters who wept at their departure ceremonies, and they held personal interests that are rarely discussed in scholarly works and hagiographies. So much of what you'll see today, especially the images, are from Jesuit archives in Rome, the Curia archives in Rome, and the French archive in Vanves. So as I prepared this talk, I wondered if there is anything about Jesuits in China that has not already been said. And it comes to mind that the Society's China mission has been depicted as a, quote, larger-than-life enterprise. They were a generation of giants, wrote George Dunn, who lived in, quote, the days of glory that lay far in the past. Now, one wonders what these Jesuits did when they weren't being giants. Who were these giants when they were simply living their daily lives? To confront this question, I draw here on the lives of just 4 Jesuits so far who are recognized as saints in the Catholic Church who were on the mission in China. Really the tallest of the giants. Was there something in the legacies of these saints that can be identified as real lives? Given the nature of hagiographies and Jesuit dramas, one might entirely miss anything commonly human about China's Jesuits. But if we dig a little deeper, we can find out about the more diurnal activities of the missionaries. And I think that what makes them visibly saints is better illustrated when we look into what is not included in the embroidered narratives of the hagiographies. Okay. Well, I just have to press with more vigor. When commenting on the Jesuit character, Honoré de Balzac said that, quote, they renounced the present for the future, looking forward only to a hereafter in heaven. He also mentions the society's dogged commitment to charity. But again, we hear nothing of the relationships and personal difficulties beneath their patina of missionary zeal. The Jesuit archive in Paris contains the personal letters of these 4 Jesuit saints who died in China, including a great deal of correspondence between them and their families. Few people know, for example, that Rémy Isoré's brother was also a priest and his sister was a nun. After joining the Jesuits in 1875, Isoré began considering a mission, and China was not his choice. He asked his provincial if he could go to Zambia in Africa. The provincial instead sent Rémy to China in 1882, about which he wrote, quote, "A kind of resentment had slipped into my heart." China was not where he wanted to be, but his letters home show that he was in time determined to overcome his resentments and attempt to befriend the people he met there. Paul Dehn lived through a rather unhappy childhood. He lost his father when he was only 2 years old. His mother lost 2 children while they were still very young, and Paul was expected to help raise his remaining siblings with only a modest family income. After only a few weeks into his novitiate, Paul Dehn was told he would soon leave for China. Now we might pause here just for a moment to remember that his likelihood of dying from travel or illness or natural disaster was around 50% at the time he traveled to China. And the lifespan of Jesuits in China was around, the average was around 40 years old. So 50% died on their way, and once they were there, the average lifespan was 40. Modeste Andlauer was born in France's Alsace region and was raised speaking both French and German, which he was sent all around Europe and in England also to teach those languages. His provincial informed him quite by surprise that he would leave for China in 1882, an assignment that he said he did not hope for. Léon Ignace Mangin, his father was a judge, which reportedly intimidated his acquaintances, and he was a very tall and imposing person. People were terrified of Mangin. Like Isoré, Dehn, and Andlauer, Mangin was reportedly taken aback when his provincial notified him in 1882 that he would join his confreres at the Jesuit mission in Zhili province, now known as Hebei. So as we consider the backgrounds, personalities, and personal hopes of each of these 4 men, we see that all were temperate and affable missionaries, but none expected or desired to go to China. All 4 of them are now canonized for dying as martyrs in China, and none of them wanted to go and complained bitterly in their correspondence. But once in China, all 4 began a process of uneasy adjustment, during which they formed new friendships while making heroic efforts to retain their old attachments with their families back in France. We should note that by the end of the 19th century, about 75%, few people know this, about 75% of Catholic missionaries in Africa and Asia were French. So the vast majority of missionaries were really French. Now, these 4 Jesuits were assigned to what must have seemed to them like a remote backwater. Beijing and Shanghai were much larger centers of Christian activity than where they began their missions at Xianxian County in Zhili. And even more, several of the most powerful bishops and clergy in leadership positions in China were Vincentians, who were in many ways the antagonists of the Jesuits. Jesuit properties were inherited by the Vincentians during the suppression. And when the Jesuits began their return to China in 1842, Vincentians were, as they put it, not ready to part with their inheritance. In addition to being swept into this old rivalry between French Vincentians and French Jesuits, these new missionaries wrote often about the difficulties of cultural adjustments. Especially, they wrote quite a lot about this harrowing practice of using chopsticks. But nothing presented more of a struggle to the missionaries than learning Chinese. Their letters home to France centered mostly on catching up with family matters, keeping up with favorite hobbies, and what they called, quote, the curse of learning Chinese tones and characters. Rémy Isoré's personal papers include examples of two of his great passions, writing poetry and composing original music scores. Isoré's musical compositions are actually quite nice pieces that, as far as I know, have never been performed. He wrote tons of music traveling to China and there. None of it's been performed before. So take a screenshot and play this on your piano. Rémy Isoré's personal papers include examples of two of his great, among the more moving items located in Paul Dunn's collected papers in France is an affectionate poem he mailed to his sister Sophie before her wedding day, written with a meticulous hand. And this poem, I think, serves to underscore the humanity of China missionaries who are so often reduced, I think, to stereotypes, convenient in the enterprise of scholarly writing that, in my mind, often tends to dehumanize persons of the past in order to support academic arguments. It's good to access humanity at times. In addition to this rather tender poem, Den's other letters home from China include explanations of the meaning and uses of Chinese characters, along with long descriptions of Chinese culture. Even the celebrated Matteo Ricci, who showed great appreciation for Chinese writing, admitted with some frustration in his private journal that the Chinese language, quote, is diametrically opposed to our own writing. Ricci also wrote that it was the Chinese language that made his hair turn gray and his beard grow into a frenetic form. Regardless of their respect for Chinese, Den and his fellow Jesuits struggled to master the language. Modest Andlauer recorded his initial impressions of China in an annotated sketchbook that recorded what he saw during his first encounters with the Qing Empire. His first view of China was of Shanghai in November of 1842. And his first notes are attempts to write Chinese characters beside drawings of pagodas and Chinese roofs. After his assignment to Wu Yi in 1893, Andlauer moved into a Chinese-style residence at one of the very few Chinese-style churches in China. By then, Andlauer had grown enthusiastic about his life in China, and his small chapel at Wu Yi was modeled after indigenous Chinese temples, breaking with the overwhelming Jesuit habit then of erecting Gothic revival edifices that towered over the landscape. Almost every Jesuit church was Gothic revival. Huge spires, quite something to see in juxtaposition to all the much smaller Chinese buildings. Even though he enjoyed his new home and friendships, Andlauer's letters suggest an enduring homesickness. In one letter he wrote, quote, "If from time to time one has an opportunity to suffer, we must say, you came on your mission, and on your mission you will just enjoy suffering," close quote. While Andlauer continued to lament the distance of his family, Leon Ignace Mangin appears to have had better adjusted to his new life in China, though he too struggled to attain proficiency in speaking and reading Chinese. In a letter to his brother, Mangin included examples of Chinese graphs he still labored to understand after 7 years in China. And in a letter to his mother written in 1888, 6 years after 6 years of Chinese study, Mangin wrote, quote, "I still cannot understand what they say, and my Chinese expressions still sound too French for them to understand what I say." He also expressed his concern over the unstable political situation in China. Quote, "We live day by day, not knowing what will happen tomorrow." Now, while these four men were still learning Chinese, making new Chinese friends, and adjusting to Chinese food, chopsticks, the Chinese they were getting to know was in the China they were getting to know was in transition. It was experiencing, as Xian Lanxin put it, quote, "tumultuous events that led to the war between China and the West." By the summer of 1900, more than 30,000 Chinese Christians had died from Boxer violence, and an unknown number, perhaps equally as high, of Boxers and Qing troops would also die from foreign vengeance. This dramatic event is what became the main topic of Jesuit theater after 1900. And the personal lives of the Jesuits and Chinese Christians who died at that time were drawn upon to promote China as a new, as they put it, a new terra sancta, a new holy land, where East Asia represented a location of great religious piety, great religious sacrifice, such that, as the Jesuits hoped, the West would again appreciate China as an upright and exemplary culture, redeemed from the negative Western assessments of the late 18th to mid-19th centuries. By May 1900, in the wake of a series of internal rebellions and growing tensions with aggressive Western forces carving China into, quote, fears of influence, the Manchu court in Beijing committed itself to make a last stand for political survival. The Jesuit fathers Isoré, Andlauer, and Mangin were thus propelled into the turbulence of the Boxer uprising. Chinese imperial troops and a popular militia of displaced peasants known in British reports as the Boxers began a summer of destruction that approached the Jesuit mission in Shenzhen by June of 1900. The Jesuits there decided to resist alongside their fellow Chinese Christians. In the mission area of southeast Zhili alone, 15 Jesuit fortresses were erected with an army of Chinese Christians and Jesuit commanders armed with rifles, cannons, swords, and spears. None of the four Jesuits I've so far discussed survived. Modeste Andlauer and Rémy Isoré both died in the Jesuit church at the small village of Wuyi. Léon Ignace Mangin and Paul Dunn were killed along with almost 3,000 Chinese Christians in one village by the name of Zhujiahe. Andlauer was warned by local Chinese Catholics to leave Wuyi and seek refuge in one of the fortified Jesuit strongholds, but he refused to abandon the people of his mission church. On the evening of June 17, Isoré went to Andlauer's residence in Wuyi, perhaps to persuade his friend to flee to safety. But by the time Isoré was with Andlauer, the village was completely surrounded by Boxers. At 6 p.m. the next day, both missionaries heard the approach of a large crowd carrying weapons. They ran into the church and prayed at the foot of the altar, while the Boxers broke through the front door and beheaded them. On June 20, a Chinese Christian went to Zhujiahe village and told Mangin and Dunn about the deaths of their two friends at Wuyi. Zhujiahe was, in fact, the next target. When the massive numbers of displaced peasants had earlier begun to form into Boxer units, Zhujiahe had 300 residents. From May to June, around 3,000 more had located to this small Christian village and had fortified the walls in preparation for an armed defense. On July 18, a force of Boxers and Qing troops attacked the wall, and by the 20th, They broke through the ramparts. During the days before the village was defeated, Fathers Marjan and Dan remained awake with almost no sleep to hear confessions and offer consolation. They exhausted themselves, preparing the villagers for what befell them. After killing nearly 2,000 defenders, a remnant of another 1,000 women, children, and elderly had crowded into the small village church. Marjan and Dan led them in prayer when around 8 o'clock in the morning, the attackers shot their rifles through the front door and windows at those inside the church. A friend of mine, Jean-Paul Wiest, has written about this. He describes, I think, this moment very well. He writes, after the shooting had ended, some boxers blocked the entrance with mattresses soaked in kerosene and set them on fire. The flames rapidly reached the reed matting which formed the ceiling. The people trapped in the church soon died of smoke inhalation. These two French Jesuit missionaries had grown so close to their Chinese friends that one woman, her name was Mary Maria Zhu, stood in front of Father Marjan and spread her arms in the sign of a cross to receive the bullets aimed at him. After it was all over, a Jesuit traveled to the village, one of the brothers, to photograph the skeletal remains of those who perished in the church. And that's the photo there. That's the exterior of the church. In the aftermath of this calamity, two priests were dispatched to collect records and eyewitness testimonies about what had happened to the missionaries and Christians who died at Wuyi and Zhujiahe. One was the Chinese Jesuit from Shanghai by the name of Li Wanyu, and the other was the French Jesuit Pierre-Xavier Merton. Li published one of the most exhaustive accounts of the Boxer Uprising, his record of the Boxer calamity, Tranmuted in Chinese. And Merton wrote what became a popular French account of the Boxer violence in that province, a book called Du sang chrétien sur le fleuve Jean, blood, Christian blood in the Yellow River. Li Wanyu and Pierre-Xavier Merton both had in mind a kind of Ignatian consolation, as they put it, one that would, they hoped, cast a more agreeable patina on the violent deaths of the Jesuit missionaries and Chinese Christians under their care, and serve to improve Western attitudes about China. So namely, both Li and Merton wished that some of these victims would someday be recognized as saints. While Merton wrote much about his European confreres, Li Wanyu clearly wished to underscore the goodness and religious piety of his fellow Chinese. Li, in his book, assigns far more miracles to Chinese Christians than he does to European missionaries. After narrating what happened at Zhujiahe, Li writes that Fathers Zhou and Pan, two Chinese priests, at the nearby village Qingcaohe, believed the Boxers to be possessed by demons. So they made the sign of the cross toward the Boxers, after which, quote, the Boxers witnessed a sudden miraculous wind, and they fled. Sometimes they would, the Boxers, the Christians, would carry holy water bottles, and they would sprinkle the Boxers, and the Boxers would run away. These Chinese priests from Qingcaohe figure prominently in later Jesuit stage dramas depicting the Boxer Uprising. Many more miracles are recorded in Jesuit books and plays, and in 1955, their efforts to draw attention to the Christians who died at Zhili yielded their intended result. The four Jesuits who had come from France struggled with their Chinese and wrote long, moving letters to their families, were beatified on April 17th by Pope Pius XII. The Jesuits, I love archival research, the Jesuits paid all costs for the lavish ceremony, and they orchestrated a grand celebration in the Vatican's most illustrious Baroque space, St. Peter's Basilica. the Jesuit archive involved had sort of lost, that I helped find, the bill from the Vatican outlining all the costs, including the very, very expensive reliquary that the Jesuits purchased for the rites. It was a very costly event. Oh, and by the way, that was the Bernini's Holy Spirit window, if you've seen it. And during canonizations and beatifications, they used to fill it with a painting. That was a rare photograph of how they used to do that. A painting of the Jesuits who died in Gerli was placed in Bernini's famous Holy Spirit window in St. Peter's. As the Pope pronounced the words of beatification, the painting was gradually revealed as the curtain was dramatically drawn apart. The huge basilica was crowded with exalted Jesuits, including many who lived in China most of their lives. A Chinese Jesuit actually stood with the Father General of the order as a large arrangement of flowers was presented to the Pope. It was featured in a ton of Jesuit journals that were published throughout Europe. So after this extravagant ceremony, both the Jesuits and China gained enormous attention in Europe. So let me just approach my conclusion. In 1925, the Father General of the Jesuits sent Pierre-Xavier Berton to visit Wuyi and Zhujiahe to discern the status of these two Jesuit missions described in letters now held in archives. When he entered the new village church at Zhujiahe, 25 years after Paul Dun and Leon Ignace Marchand had died in the previous church, a banner still hung above the altar that read, 死者安息, or may those who have died here rest in peace. And flanking the two sides of the nave were 12 panels that recorded 1,800 of the known names of those who died there in 1900. Now, before I conclude, let me just get to the center of what I'm trying to argue here, or suggest. I should turn briefly to the Enlightenment, which I've been leading to until this point. And I just want to mention, I just spent a semester in Scotland, and I should note Scotland's tribute to China. The Edinburgh literatist David Hume praised China for its, quote, considerable stock of politeness and science, and also for its unity of language, law, and manners. But Hume was also a bit critical of what he viewed as a certain stagnancy, noting that, quote, the sciences have made so slow a progress in that mighty empire. But for Hume, China was noteworthy because of its effective governance by virtue of what he said was natural law rather than revealed law. Hume saw in China a coherent standard by which to judge European governments. China was, for Hume, an analog of governance that functioned more effectively than in the West because it functioned, in his view, without the shackles of Western Christianity. Hume's admiration for China was shared by a ton of other Scottish literati, such as Francis Horner and Adam Smith, though Smith's high opinion of China was tempered by his economic belief that China would remain stagnant until it opened to international trade. So how do the Jesuit saints and dramatists in China fit into what I've just recounted, especially vis-a-vis the Enlightenment? Their staged performances based on Boxer-era conflicts highlighted another form of Chinese prominence, a prominence based on religious enthusiasm and witness. When Pierre-Xavier Berton arrived in Hebei in 1916, he met the descendants of some who had died at Zhujiahe, and he was aware of Li Wanyu's histrionic representation of how his two French confreres consoled the Chinese faithful until their own deaths. Merton, who had already written Jesuit plays in his native France, wrote a drama to commemorate the Zhujiahe martyrs. He hoped this play would function to underscore how Chinese, once they were Christianized, were not only distinct from the culture then villainized in Western publications, but also even more noble by nature than their Western counterparts. Merton's plays attracted large Chinese audiences, and his most popular one was his 主教和殖民剧, or the drama of the martyrs of 主教和, published in 1931. He actually wrote a French version of it that was sent to Rome and is still in the Roman Curia archives of the Society of Jesus. Published in 1931, this 3-act play was a melodramatic Baroque reconstruction of the siege of the village in 1900, performed by Chinese school children as a hagiographical celebration of the Jesuit and lay Christian martyrs of the village Zhongguo. Like other Jesuit plays staged after the Boxer Uprising in China, this one was a cinified manifestation of Baroque theater, abounding with elaborate set designs and impassioned scenes employed to stimulate the same pious sentiments Ignatius structured his spiritual exercises to activate. This Baroque trait of the Society of Jesus was summoned to represent the strong character of both the Chinese and non-Chinese Jesuits who occupied Hebei. On the stages of China's many Jesuit establishments appeared both saints and those of the society, those that the society hoped would be recognized as saints. Albeit, and this is worth noting, the sumptuous sets created by Gian Lorenzo Bernini were in China converted into emotive religious performances with actors wearing the costume and makeup of traditional Chinese opera. Now, several photographs of a 1935 Jesuit drama performed in Shanghai are preserved in Brussels that illustrate what a characteristic performance looked like after the Society's 1842 return to China. And here are the images. These images are of a children's performance of the play 古生活是白话演义, or a vernacular drama on the ancient Saint Joseph, originally written and published in 1925. Now, extravagant sets depicting the Old Testament story of Joseph's betrayal by his brothers and subsequent life in Egypt are crowded with elaborately costumed performers. Seen in the photographs are sets comparable to those, in fact, copying those of Bernini, produced 3 centuries earlier in his play Il San Alessio in 1634. This Chinese Jesuit play was staged and performed at the Jesuit Xujiahui Mission Complex in Shanghai, often pronounced Zikahui, to welcome the participants of the Catholic Action First National Conference in 1935, which was itself a grand affair accompanied by unrestrained spectacle. While the 1930s Jesuits in China produced plays such as the ones about Zhu Jiahe and Joseph, they also staged photographs of pious Chinese Catholics that appear as 20th century examples of Baroque tableaus. They actually staged people with their rosaries and scapulars, they were copying Baroque paintings. They sought to resurrect the Baroque in order to resurrect China's former patina of greatness that formerly pervaded the Western imagination of the Celestial Empire. Western saints depicted in Baroque art now appeared in Baroque photos of China's holy faithful. My own research just recently has revealed around 4 main questions, and here I'll conclude. 4 main questions. How did the Jesuit mission in China serve to present the imagined China that the West acclaimed during the 18th century? How did the later Jesuit mission attempt to represent a newly imagined China during the 19th and 20th centuries? How did Jesuit drama fit into these representations? And finally, how have missionary representations over the centuries served to engender cross-cultural imaginations of world Christianity? And more specifically, for those of us who've read Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, how have these representations created imagined Christianities? Among the things that the Jesuits spent an awful lot of time working on was, in fact, the whole idea of a linguistic, these linguistic charts that trace the roots of words back there. This was a Jesuit project to try and discover what the Edenic language was. So if you can study languages and you trace their roots, you can trace it back to the language of Adam and Eve. And there was this whole idea of the pre-Babel language. It's a huge Jesuit project that was finally abandoned. In fact, I should say, I love this. One of my favorite things about being a China scholar is that what the Jesuits concluded was that since Chinese historiography did not match biblical historiography, that it's obvious that somehow even sacred scripture had missed that the Chinese weren't part of the Tower of Babel incident, and that Mandarin was in fact the language of Adam and Eve. I love that. They were adamant about that. If you speak Mandarin, you're speaking the language of the garden. So anyway, that was a tangent. I told myself I wouldn't do a tangent. I'm interested in how Asia, 70% of our world's population, I'm interested in how Asia and the Jesuits who lived there served to change the Western intellectual landscape during the Enlightenment, and how the society labored to reinsert into the Western intellectual lexicon during the 19th and 20th century a form of praise and adulation that would redeem and resurrect China as an example of a great, potentially Christianized culture. All right, well, yes, I'll end there.
Professor Clark, thank you. It's a tradition at the Socratic Club that we invite conversation. So questions, comments? I'll let Professor Clark handle your comments. I'm not sure if it's fair for you to let Trent handle.
Yeah, right, I know. But no, why not? You should be the inaugural question.
I'm curious. No, that was great. Thank you very much for that presentation. I already just over that, obviously. The question I've got is kind of two-part. So you say that there's some imaginary having to do with the actual performance the Jesuits created. Was this all 20th century artifact, or are there actual Ming dynasty plays that Jesuits put on to depict this Christian glory? And if not, because the Joanna Wade Cohen books, there's an entire genre. It says the whole dialogue was about technology and mathematics, right? To the point that even Matteo Ricci is turned into a secular figure.
Yeah.
So how? I mean, why would the Jesuits? Why did they appropriate an older theatrical form if it wasn't? Or I guess that's the question. Was it already in China?
That's question one, right?
It's kind of the same question.
Kind of the same question.
That's the whole question.
Yeah. Okay. So I love this. I mean, the Jesuits were writing theater from almost the beginning of the order, and all Chinese dramatic scripts were, well, not all, but most were in Latin. So it was a way to teach school kids to perform plays in Latin. It was a way to perform hagiography. So that was already embedded, I think, in the DNA of the society when they went to China. Ricci shows up in the 1580s, 1590s, that's the very end of the Ming. And that was already a Jesuit thing, to have theater, right? But by the century after Ricci, they are performing plays, and they're combining it. I love this, right? So they're looking at late Ming, early Qing forms of drama, and they're combining it with the Baroque plays that they would perform. Like in the Jesuit, they had this apotheosis of Xavier and Ignatius, and little crabs dancing out onto the stage, and the whole story, of Xavier and the crab in the water bringing back his cross. They're combining those plays with Ming and Qing dynasty like theater, and they're wearing the costume of theater. So it's like, in my mind, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but it's a hybrid. Jesuit theater is a hybrid, combining their own tradition with the Chinese tradition.
Good question. You mentioned your research. Like, how do you research, or how do you use your research a little bit? What does that look like for you?
What does it look like? The process?
Yeah, the process.
I go to Rome. I drink a lot of good wine, and a lot of good coffee, and I go into the archives and just work through materials. So in the Curia in Rome is just a fantastic, I mean, I would say that the China mission was just predominantly Jesuit. There were some contenders, Dominicans, Franciscans, Ascensions, but the materials that are held by the Jesuits in Rome are just extraordinary. And then there are other archives like this. If 75% of the mission was French, then you have to go to the Paris archive and look at those documents. So my research basically is just to go and have a great time in Paris and Rome and look through archival documents and think about, how do I fit this into a large narrative? And then the other part of that is that I'm loath to have too much of a one-sided way of looking at this exchange between the West, right? So I don't want to go and just look at, French and Latin or whatever documents. I want to go and I want to look at Chinese documents. So from my point of view, I really, really, really want to access what the Chinese were saying. So luckily, the Jesuits had an enormous number of Chinese priests in their big missions in Shenzhen and Shanghai. And so I like to look at Chinese documents. And some of those are in mainland, so you can access those in mainland. And I love this too. The next part is go to the local village in China where these people lived, and they've been keeping their own records over the past generation. So the village at Zhujiahe that you saw the photograph of, the granddaughter of the woman who spread out her arms and received the bullets, the granddaughter is still alive. So I interviewed the granddaughter who heard family stories. So it's just nice to interview people who, they heard from grandma what happened, because some people survived that. So it's just the beautiful thing about being a historian is connecting all these dots, right? You'll never get the full story, but you connect enough dots and you have, I think, a pretty good narrative. But it includes a lot of good food and alcohol.
Obviously, your area of expertise is China, but I'm curious how you would compare the experience of not just these 4 priests, but other missionaries to China with regards to cultural acclimation in other parts of the world.
So so how do I please say that again? Cultural acclimation, how do I think about it? How do I
How would
process
you
it?
compare the acclimation to the culture of
China
missionaries to China versus missionaries to other parts of
and
the
other
world?
parts. That depends on the order, right? I mean, it's right. So you had missions in Africa. You had missions in Latin America. You had Iberian Peninsula missions. You had missions here, right? From multiple orders, Franciscans, Jesuits. And you had missions in Asia, Japan, and China. So if I'm thinking about the Society of Jesus, before the suppression, until 1773, the Jesuits, I think, are very good at a kind of acclimation, right? A kind of enculturation, if you want to use that word. Then you have this little thing called, the rights controversy, which is arguing about whether or not you can have Confucian rituals, right? And the pre-suppression Jesuits said, fine, you can have Confucian rituals, no problem. You can have tablets with your ancestral names. It's no different than maybe having a painting or a photograph of a relative. But the post-suppression Jesuits had to take an oath of loyalty to the Vatican's ruling that the rites were wrong. So they had to literally prove themselves. Prove themselves obedient to the Vatican in terms of not allowing those things that the Vatican had condemned. What that means then is that before 1773, the Jesuits are very good at acclimating, but after 1842, they're horrible at it, right? And they're building, that's where the whole French neo-Gothic, Gothic revival architecture comes into play. And, but you can see some of that old DNA resurfacing, right? But by and large, I think the Jesuits weren't nearly as good at that in China afterward. And that general rule applies to a lot of different places, including Africa. The Dominicans, really bad at enculturation, I would say. They were probably the most anti-Jesuit of all the orders, and for them it was preach Christ and Christ crucified, and don't be afraid of the crucifix. And Ricci very wisely knew that you have to take things incrementally. And so did Valignano and all these other Jesuits. So that is to say, I think the Jesuits were by and large better than other orders at enculturation and acculturation. But not perfect at the end of the day.
Is there anything you could say about comparing the Jesuit missions to China with the Presbyterian missions?
Yeah, I could say, yeah, there are some really, and so
I mean, who's better at acculturation, for example?
Jesuits.
Here.
But, I mean, I teach at a Presbyterian institution, so on this campus, on that campus, I would say the same thing. The thing is that if you look at Presbyterians, which were huge, Presbyterians and Baptists, the huge missions, right? They were better at opening higher education, like colleges. Actually, even better at opening middle schools and high schools, if you want to use that term for the Chinese context, than the Catholics were, all of them, including the Jesuits. Jesuits had schools for boys, schools for girls, they had orphanages, all of that. But they weren't really opening colleges, and the Presbyterians opened a lot of colleges, and that made them very popular because a lot of Chinese thought that those colleges could empower them to modernize and the like. So in that sense, the Jesuits wanted to, in fact, it was a Chinese Jesuit by the name of Zhongguo who said, the Presbyterians are doing so good at colleges that we need to open our own colleges. He wrote to Rome. Rome said, open colleges. And he had the struggle with getting money to open the colleges. But then he opened Beijing University, he opened Aurora University. So then the Jesuits, it was the Jesuit enterprise, that and some Benedictines, who basically tried to catch up with the Protestants. So I think the Jesuits were far more adept at enculturation, but education, even though that was in their DNA, they didn't do it as well as the Presbyterians at first, and then they tried to catch up. It's a long answer. Let's go. Well, then we'll go to Eric.
Okay, so what about the fact that the Jesuits were celibates and the Presbyterians would be bringing their families?
Yeah.
So did that affect how they immerse themselves in Chinese culture?
It did. Married families typically created enclaves. Now the French were very enclaval. They would wear Chinese clothing, but they had separate cafeterias. The French Jesuits had a French cafeteria and a Chinese cafeteria. If you were a Chinese brother or priest, you went to the Chinese cafeteria, and the French reserved their cafeteria for themselves. Americans, I'm answering your question somewhat circuitously. American Jesuits who went in the 1920s hated that the French all had beards, and so they wanted to be clean-cut Americans, clean-shaven Americans, and the French and the Americans had fights over this. Little things that you didn't have in married communities, but celibate missionaries typically were more, I would say, more enculturated. They didn't do things like the Presbyterians and the Baptists open horse racing. facilities, and they had Victorian houses built, and they would fit their homes with pianos, and they would try to basically westernize people. And then the other part of that I think is very significant is that when things like the Boxer Uprising happened, and there were social threats, the Jesuits would remain because they didn't have families to worry about, and they would remain and serve the people. And the married families would typically leave China and go on furlough during the turbulence. So the Jesuits were there and kept, I mean, as a historian, we're all happy because they were there writing what was happening. Most of the Protestants had gone back to their, Europe, England, or America. So, Eric.
I was just curious, do we know if there was any attempts on the part of the Jesuits during the Qing dynasty to reappropriate or to reproduce the South American reductions?
The South American.
The reductions, like in Paraguay, some, these paradise communities
Right.
that were once greatly praised.
Yeah.
I think they disappeared with this oppression.
I don't know that. I mean, I should look into that.
I don't know either. So I just
Yeah, I just don't know. That's a good question. I love that question.
we know
I'll
know
look
about
into that.
Protestant day-to-day missionary activities a lot. Right? There's a lot of but
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. But I can say something about the day-to-day, right? So there are two forms of epistolary exchange in the Jesuits. One is what they call the lettres édificantes, the edifying letters that the public could read, and the other were the ones you would write to your provincial, you would send to Rome, and those were the private, the internal letters. And I love that the society allows scholars to now look at the internal letters, because then I think you get way more like diurnal information. What's it like day to day? You also get little things like, I don't like father so-and-so and brother so-and-so. I don't like how he cooks. So you get these, interpersonal, like, more gritty things. But about the reduction, I don't know that. That's a good question. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Doctor, for your talk. I was wondering, as you mentioned, we focused on the lives of 4 French Jesuit saints on mission in China. But I was curious about, as you mentioned, there was a good number of Chinese-born Jesuits, and I was wondering if you could give a word or two about, the state of affairs. Were there a lot of them, or did it grow over time? What was it like?
Boy, that question is huge because I don't know where to begin.
Oh, sorry.
No. I love that question. So yes, there were quite a few. And in the early mission, there were debates. I mean, here's a good way to approach this question. There were a lot of debates. Let's now make it back up, because here, in many ways, Jesuits and Vincentians and Dominicans and Society of the Divine Word, in many ways they disagreed with each other. I think they agreed with each other on the fundamentals, but in many ways they disagreed with each other, mostly in terms of methodology, right? But they all agreed with this, and that is, they all agreed that there needs to be a way to think about the training of Chinese to become brothers or clergy. So they all agreed, how do we think about this? The next layer of debates are, can Chinese learn Latin? That was a huge debate. So many, both Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, I would say the majority of them thought Chinese couldn't learn Latin. So they can't be clergy. They can be brothers, but they can't be clergy. So that was a big obstacle. Once they figured out that the Chinese can learn Latin, then it sort of opened the floodgates, and all of the various orders started to invite Chinese. Here's a good question. So there were a lot of Chinese Jesuits, but there were very few Chinese clergy for a while, and there were no Chinese bishops. There had been one Chinese bishop from the 1700s, and the next Chinese bishop, 6 of them were consecrated in 1926, right? So the big debate was, now we can have clergy, we can have brothers, but can we have bishops? And 1926, they had a meeting in Shanghai, and all of the bishops who processed out of the church, the Jesuit church, St. Ignatius Church in Shanghai, all of the bishops were European and white. And it was filmed by an American Colombian priest, and that film was shown to people, and they said, we can't do this any longer. We can't have an entire hierarchy in China that is white. We need some Chinese bishops. And that was 1925. 1926, you suddenly have the Pope saying, it's done, we need to consecrate bishops. And one of them was Jesuit. And the Pope, the bishops in China actually refused. So the Pope ordered 6 Chinese priests to go to Rome, and the Pope himself consecrated 6 Chinese bishops in the Vatican and St. Peter's in 1926. So there were a lot. It was a huge debate. And the big debate at the end was whether or not the Chinese should govern their own church. And of course, now all the bishops in China are Chinese.
Dr. Clark, thank you. I'm asking from the perspective of priestly formations and seminary work, and there was a question of readiness, right? And so it sounds like there are a lot of on-the-job training, as it were, in China, especially for the language and so forth. Do you have a sense on how did the Jesuit superiors determine that this man was in fact ready to ship out?
Oh, wait. Ship out to the mission?
To the mission, right, yes. Or is it just you've done the exercises, you are ordained, and now you can,
So they have, in the society there is this tradition, classically, that you have these letters that are called impete. So a Jesuit who wanted to go on mission would write a letter, and they're usually really saccharine, pious letters, like, I want to go to China, I want to be a martyr, I want to, a lot of them wrote, I want to follow the footsteps of Francis Xavier, right, who went to Japan. So they would write these letters to their provincials, and the provincials would decide, who do we select, and how do we dispatch them, right? Who's mature, who has the zeal? So most of them wrote letters asking for a specific mission. What the Jesuits didn't know, I don't know if I'm answering your question, because discernment is 2 ways, right? The discernment of the superior and the discernment of the priest and the brother. Most of the people who asked to go to a certain place did not get to go there. They would be sent someplace else. Which meant that if they'd known that, they might have just said, I want to go to Africa if they wanted to go to China. Or I want to go to China if they wanted to go to Africa. But most of them were sent someplace else. And I suspect that had to do with the ideal of obedience, right? You should go out of obedience and serve under that aegis rather than go where you want to go. Some did go to China and were sent. I do know that having looked at some of these letters and some of the responses, that the superiors, the provincials, they would often write back pretty honest responses. We don't think you're ready. You're not mature enough. The big one was you're not physically fit enough to go on a mission because half the people are dying. Another one was you've lived a life in wealth. You'll be living a life of poverty. Maybe you're not suited for this new lifestyle. So there were a lot of pragmatic reasons. But there was a great deal related to their spiritual state. Right? So I think the more pious often were given favor, but also people who had pragmatic skills, like if they were astronomers, or if they could intellectually impress people, then send them as missionaries. So for the missions, the pastoral was not often prioritized, right? If you were someone who showed pastoral sensibilities, go to a parish, or if you showed intellectual priorities, go teach at the Roman college in Gregorian or something. So I don't know if that sort of answers that.
It does, thank you. And just as a follow-up, did this provincial of these French Jesuits give any reported rationale for why they were selected for the mission in China?
Yes. But it's usually, yes, they have. And usually it's because they find them fitted, they find them fitting for certain things that would fit their ethos. Like they were, like I said, they were good at astronomy, or they were good at math, or they could serve to teach, or someone, here's another one, someone knows how to, who was an architect, or who had architectural training. You know, we're going to build these Gothic revival churches, we need them built. So you're a Jesuit, you have these sensibilities, off you go. In Shanghai, there was a brother by the name of Beck, who was French, and he was this master of painting and carving, and he was sent to Shanghai to teach orphans skills that they could use out in the world. So that's the kind of criteria, you know, that would often inform the provincials for sending them out.
As a, I guess, follow-up question to my previous one, you mentioned briefly that when the Pope decided to ordain native-born Chinese to be bishops, you said that there was resistance and that the Pope had to ordain himself. So why was there resistance?
Well, I think a predominance of the bishop's resistance had to do with, there's so many factors, which do I pick? One, let's say you're a vicariate or a province or a diocese. There were some dioceses, and it was the bishops had been Dominican, right? So they were inherited Dominican sees. Often the Dominican, who would be French, knew other French Dominicans, knew his clergy were largely Dominicans, they were mostly French, and they often wanted the control of that vicariate or diocese to remain under their order. And so in some instances it was just purely parochial. They wanted it to stay within their order. They didn't feel there were any Chinese who were ready to become bishops, and often they were afraid that if the Vatican imposed Chinese bishops, that they would lose control of their area. That was one issue. Another issue was just, I think, racism. I mean, I'll call it, right? I think a lot of the hierarchy thought that Chinese weren't ready to be in charge of their own vicariate as a bishop. What was interesting is that there was a psychology of mission, right? This is, let's just say 1850, right, or 1890. There was the psychology that China was a missionary territory. But interestingly, the first Christian missionary to China was 635 AD, right? So that's like saying that, I love it when Americans say to me, oh, China, we need to send more missionaries. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. China's had Christianity since 635. It's a much older Christian, it has a much longer Christian history than we do. So do we need to send missionaries? Maybe we do need to send missionaries to the United States. But I mean, it's just an interesting psychology. And then here's the last thing I'll say, and this doesn't make the missionaries look very good. If you were, not all the missionaries were approved of this, but if you were Chinese and you met a foreign priest, or if you met a European or American bishop, you were required in most places to kowtow. You had to get on your knees and hit your head on the floor to show due respect for that bishop. And there was just an awful lot of empowerment that happened with the bishops. And you had some missionaries like Vincent Leb and others whose goal in life was to disempower the foreign bishops so that the Chinese church could actually govern itself. And once that happened, true story, I love this, once China had its own Chinese bishops, the number of Christians, but the number of Catholics just exploded, right? Because there's something, I speak Chinese, but I don't think my Chinese is nearly as compelling to a Chinese person as someone who's been raised in it, right? So I think racism, empowerment, territorialism, all those were parts of it. Not that and it almost sounds like they were just all evil people. Some of them were really good people, just had this psychology that they couldn't get out of.
I have a question that I'm afraid is so complex, I'm not going to be able to ask it very well, which is going to make it very hard for you to respond. But here's my try. I mean, one of the most interesting dimensions of your work, I think, is this whole question of enculturation, especially enculturation as part of evangelistic or missionary activities. So there's a message to transmit, but often what happens is that message gets so embedded in a cultural expression that really it's not, if I can put this in Christian terms, it's not the gospel that's being communicated.
Yeah.
It's a package of Western assumptions and so forth. So you see how my question is already getting complicated.
No,
It's not a
totally
question
get
yet. So I'm curious about your perception and all the work you've done, and it's related to this last point that you were making about an indigenous church and the growth of the church as Catholic Christianity. One other thing that I'll throw in prior to asking the question, and that is, I'm guessing, what little I know about this, it's very hard to get statistics about the population levels of Christians in China because of the hostility of the Chinese regime toward religion. So there's that. But what I'm curious about, and here's the question: what can you say about the effectiveness of evangelistic and missionary activities, almost in relation or dynamically connected to this question of enculturation? In other words, how effective or how deeply, you can either think of it in terms of numbers, how many people convert to Christianity as a result of Christian activities, but you can also put it in terms of how deeply does the heart of the Christian gospel penetrate people and speak to them. Related to this question of how effectively the message is enculturated.
Yeah.
You see what I mean
Yeah,
about
I
how
totally
messy
get
the question is?
Yeah, and my answer, I think, is going to be peripatetic, to use that word again.
Fair enough.
So the first part, kind of about, I interpret your question as being, and this is, I teach a course on the history of Christianity in Asia, and we talk about how Xavier went, Professor Cunningham has written about this, how when Xavier was in Japan, there was a question of terms and adopting term, what's the proper term for God, and then to basically adopt Buddhist terms. And so at what point, what is it, the question my students and I struggle with is, so what is the minimum for it to be authentically Christian? Right? And when is it not no longer Christian? When is it Christian? What is that line, right? When do you blow up the balloon so much with enculturation that it pops, it's no longer Christianity? I think that's a really huge question. And I think of it, I ponder this, right? I mean, Wittgenstein said the limits of our language are the limits of our world. So how much can we even say that languages are easier or more difficult for one to have Christianity? If you think about the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, English. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Latin. In nomine du Père, du Fils et du Saint-Esprit, French. In Fu Jesus German, Chinese. They're all, if I should take the Chinese, the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and break it down, I could problematize if it could even possibly mean the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Right? Or in John, in the beginning was the Word. Logos is a complicated term. How do I translate that in Chinese? There is nothing like that in Chinese, right? So how do I think about that particular problem, translating into Chinese? And then a lot of people said, Tao, way, but that's complicated because is it the Taoist Tao? Is it the Confucian Tao? The Christian Tao? And so this problem of language is something I ponder. At some point, what the Chinese say is that God breaks through all of this. And God is the one that baptizes our hermeneutic of this cultural thing, right? So there are lots of cultural things. So that's a complicated thing. The numbers question is very difficult. And the cultural thing is also a complicated question because Western missionaries have been now for about a century saying that Chinese Christians need to indigenize their church. So Western missionaries, American missionaries, French missionaries, German missionaries, British missionaries have said, you need to design your churches to look Chinese. And the Chinese, overwhelming Chinese response is, don't tell us how to build our churches. If you want us to decide what it looks like to be a Chinese Christian, let us decide what we want our Chinese Christianity to look like. And so in China, about 98 to 99.8% of the time, when you give a Chinese congregation carte blanche, you design your church as you want it to, they almost always make a Gothic church. And there are a few Chinese-style churches in China, and those were built by missionaries. And so when the government says today in China the church needs to be Sinicized, I'm in pews a lot, and the Chinese Catholics are saying, Sinicized, what does that mean? What we want is to look, they say we don't want to look like we're an enclave, we want to look like part of the universal church. And if we look like we're the universal church, then maybe a Western-style church makes us feel part of the universal church. So I love that question, but it's a challenging one because even in China, there are huge questions about what it looks like to be Chinese as a Christian. And I think most Chinese would say, it's a relationship with God and a doctrinal staying within the parameters of sort of orthodoxy. That's what makes them Christian. But mostly it's that relationship that makes them Christian. And my baptism, so if you're Catholic or Orthodox in China, baptism is that entry point. So I love that question. It's a complicated question and it requires an entire semester.
Fair enough. Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense from your historical reading, or even, I don't know, I suppose some of this might be contemporary news. Has there been a problem of emergence of non-Orthodox Christianities in China that are due to this problem of cultural transmission? And what can you say about that?
I don't want to say it's cultural transmission, maybe. I just think it's culturally Chinese to take a religion and... So I was at Mass once in China, and it was the Feast of St. Joseph, right, in the Catholic Church. And the priest was giving his homily, exhorting the people in the church, you need to stop having a statue of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, the Buddha, right? You need to, and then you have a St. Joseph statue. And he had just been to a dinner with a Catholic family, and they had asked the Buddha for something, a favor in the family, and they had asked Joseph for something, and Joseph had not given it to them. So they had turned the statue of Joseph around and pushed his nose against the wall because they were punishing St. Joseph. And the priest was like, stop. So what is that, like, I just think it's Chinese to have a kind of what I call a religious salad bar, right? To make a good salad, you pick your Buddhist carrots, you pick your Taoist croutons, and maybe your Catholic romaine lettuce. So that's a common thing to sort of mix and match, and I think that cultural fabric is still there, and so how do we process that? This is a huge question, but that's not to say that there aren't very, very orthodox, however you want to define that, and for me as a Catholic, it's the Nicene Creed. But, it's not that those people aren't there. right? In the Christian church, it's just that there's a culture of kind of hybridity and eclecticism in religious practice, and the government would rather you be either a Protestant or a Catholic or a Buddhist or a Taoist. The government's very adamant, don't be a heterodox version of it.
Really?
So 100%. And
That's
the
surprising.
government will sometimes actually, if there were several groups who would dress in clerical collars, they would wear bishops' mitres and croziers, but they weren't Catholic, and they believed in various second comings of some Buddhist bodhisattva. They were wearing Catholic clothing, and the government had exhibits dedicated to trying to shut them down because the government wanted them to be categorically one thing. But this is all complicated too because the Bishop of Shanghai now has just passed an order that everyone in the Diocese of Shanghai reads the writing of Xi Jinping. So he's saying you have to have a hybrid of this Marxist thought and Catholic doctrine. No one in Shanghai, all the people in the pews are resisting, but the special circumstances in China.
Is this the bishop that was appointed by the government, or wasn't there a controversy about
Yes.
the?
Yeah. The Vatican had not agreed on his appointment. You had a question?
Yeah. Did I understand you correctly that China had an effect on the Enlightenment?
Thinking. In 1755, Voltaire read a Jesuit, Joseph Remar, published a translation of a Yuan dynasty play called The Orphan of Zhao. In that translation, it was in Latin, he went to Europe, Voltaire read it, he translated it from the Latin into French. He read it in a salon to a massive room of Enlightenment thinkers, where he argues that China is the perfect example of what the Enlightenment was. Hume studied at a Jesuit college in France, read Duhal's Jesuit writings of China, Premar's Jesuit writings of China, and they all went back, and Adam Smith, Leibniz, Voltaire, they all were talking about how China was kind of this model for this new Enlightenment thinking, because they had this idea of the philosopher king, right? That is, China is ruled by a great philosopher who was a secularist, who was, they said, rational. Confucianism was a rational philosophy that was a social philosophy that was without a kind of deity. So I think, in my opinion, this needs to be exploited. I think the Jesuits in China were a huge cause of the frenzy of the Enlightenment that was happening back in Europe. But the Jesuits, by the way, disagreed with it. They disagreed with how the Enlightenment took their own writings. So part of what I was trying to suggest today was that they're responding to the fact that what they had written had been usurped and used by the Enlightenment, and the Jesuits were trying to basically take all that back and recast it. The same Chinese that you think are without religion, this is what they look like as Christians. So I think Europe has this Chinoiserie frenzy. People are having Chinese-esque things all around them, and that's largely from the Jesuits. Premar published a book, a translation of Chinese history, where he illustrated Chinese chariots and emperors. And the Westerners are looking at these engravings and they're creating Chinoiserie. So I think the Enlightenment was largely a response to what's going on in China.
We're actually a moment over time.
Oh goodness gracious, so sorry.
Final. No, it's not. It's my shepherding here. But does anyone have a final question or comment? Let's thank our speaker.